Hi, I'm Steve Addison, and this is the Movements Podcast. The podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're talking to Troy Cooper, movement pioneer in South Florida, where he and his family are involved in multiplying disciples and churches. Troy began by sharing how he came to know Christ.
I was born into a family that was very far from God. My mom's mother was a Holocaust survivor and moved to the States and married a soldier. And so my mom grew up in a home with abuse and there even the occult. My grandma got involved in the occult. And so it was just a very broken home, a lot of brokenness. Same with my father. His home was very, a lot of brokenness. So they brought that into their marriage. And their circle of friends were all their siblings and cousins, and they used to just basically party and have jobs and had kids. And there was a man who was a school administrator. He wasn't a full-time pastor or missionary. He shared the gospel with one of my relatives, my Aunt Delana, and she believed. And then she and her husband came to faith, and they began to share with that community of friends, including my parents, and one by one, the households came to faith, and eventually my parents did. And I saw the change in their life when I was young. I was a 5-year-old boy, but I saw the difference in them and heard the gospel and believed. And so we
You're just 5.
Yeah, I was 5 years old, but I remember the darkness in our home. And how it changed my parents to where they became loving and soft, gentle, I guess. But looking back on it, my aunt was a person of peace. And God used her to bring the gospel to the whole community. So from that point on, I grew up in a Christian home, went to Christian school, and Christian university. And it wasn't until I went to Liberty University in Virginia. That's where I met my wife, Rachel. And she was a missionary kid from Japan. And after I graduated from college, they invited me to go over to Japan on a mission trip. And I was a pre-med major, so I was on my way to graduate school and then med school. And but at 23 years old, going over to Japan and for the first time in my life being used by God in some way. Like I was actually entrusted with ministry. It was intoxicating. It was incredible. It was just like, man, I can't believe that God could use me. I want to do this. So we're in Japan for a year, and the Lord really used that time to help us learn more about the process. And he also, at that time, showed us that he wanted to use our children. Up to that point, it was mostly me as the youth pastor, and my wife and children weren't really involved. And so my wife was my interpreter in Japan, so she had to be closely involved in what I was doing. And one day she asked me to take the boys with me on a prayer walk. So I took them, and we were prayer walking, and I began to hear them pray their own prayers. Like they weren't using words that I was using, and praying boldly. And I realized this 6-year-old and this 8-year-old actually went to school with these kids in the community. So God was speaking through them, and he taught me, hey, I want to use your whole family. So that was a game changer. And another thing that we learned in Japan, God just broke our hearts for lostness while we were there. And then he redirected us back to the United States.
We're really praying through the four corners of the U.S. where most lostness is. And we were wanting to be a part of a team. And so God answered both of those. The first one was Jeff Sundell contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in being part of, at the time it was the 55-50 vision, but it's grown into the No Place Left vision. Just being a part of going after No Place Left in North America. And then we got a call from a church down in South Florida where my nephew, who was 16 at the time, he was multiplying disciples and groups in his high school, and their church took notice of that and asked us, would we come down to South Florida as missionaries to come help catalyze movements down there. And, so it was through my 16-year-old nephew that they actually took notice. And so it was Covenant Fellowship Baptist Church, and Pastor Matt Price said, we'll love on your family. We'll provide a place for you to train, and we'll just release you to the community. And so we prayed, and God just opened up that door. So we moved down to Stuart, Florida, which is right in the midst of a community that's 96% unchurched. And recently, according to George Barna, we're smack dab in the middle of the highest population in the U.S. of never churched people. And so you've got these beautiful beaches, and it's just a lovely place to live, but a lot of lostness.
Yeah.
And so our original strategy was to go down. We believe there's two fronts. There's lost people, and so we share the gospel with lost people, and if they believe, then we disciple them to obey Jesus, including the Great Commission, with a strategy to multiply disciples and churches. But we also see another front, and that's the local church, Christ's bride. And so we wanted to make ourselves available for churches and leaders and organizations that have a vision for lostness, that have a need for training, to provide that for them, some training and coaching. And so as we went down there, we started training in Stuart, and immediately the first training, we saw 33 people come to faith as church members were equipped and mobilized into the community. And it was amazing to watch them just come alive, because they were thinking, people won't want to hear this. And there was a group, we train them and say, now go share. And there was a group that went to Walmart, and it was half of them were teenagers, 9 o'clock on a Friday night. And within an hour, they led over, I think it was about 11 people came to faith at a Walmart. And, so we started to see people coming to Christ. What I was really surprised by, Steve, was how many churches and leaders were interested in being trained. We as catalysts, we kind of posture ourselves as we engage churches. We're watching for, where is God working? Where is he moving? Looking for some movement indicators, like vision. And is there a burden for lostness? Are they making attempts? Do they have a vision that's bigger than just growing their church, but wanting to reach their community? And when we find those kind of indicators, then we feel like our role is to learn from what God is doing there, to serve it like crazy, and to pray for it. And so God connected me with Steve Wright and Jimmy Scroggins at First Baptist Church of West Palm. It's now known as Family Church. And I saw those movement indicators. They had a God-sized vision to see 100 churches started. They were making a lot of attempts. Jimmy's actually the one who developed the 3 Circles gospeling tool, so they're passionate about trying to reach lost people with the gospel. And they were going hard after it. They had their people were praying for lost people. They had filled out little cards, and they'd get down on their knees at the beginning of a service and just pray for their lost neighbors and family members. And it was amazing. But at the same time, they were hungry for some training, and I think what they were really looking for was a process. And so we went in and we served them by providing training and coaching for their team. But it was I want to reiterate, God was already at work in them, moving them down this path. And so we were just doing our best to stay out of the way. I think they really launched their training in the fall of last year. And within 6 months, by God's grace, they saw their baptisms from the previous year had tripled. They saw over 250 baptisms. their attendance went up by 40%, and their giving was stabilized. And the reason why that's significant is most of the growth was new believers, and their giving was stabilized. So,
what were they doing for discipleship? Was that just more people in the auditorium, or what was happening in terms of those new believers growing?
No, they started using, George, what we're using is the 7 Commands of Christ, which was a discipleship set that George Patterson developed for in movements in Honduras, and what Jeff and the guys in North India were using. It's what most of, not all, there's a number of different discipleship sets like Ying's and Gary Stumps and others that are seeing fruit of multiplication. We just happen to be using the 7 commands.
So people are being discipled in obedience-orientated discipleship.
That's correct.
And are most of the people joining the large church, or is there a mixture of what's happening there?
Yeah, I'd say there's a mixture. At this time, their primary vision is to multiply what they call missional communities. And so the majority of them are attending they've got 7 different campuses that each have their own pastors. They've planted 6 different churches in the community, and each of those churches are church planting churches. But their strategy for saturating the community with the gospel is mobilizing the church to share the gospel, start missional communities that will multiply, and then eventually churches.
Great.
But they are... the baptisms they're doing baptisms together on the beach, but they're letting the person who led the person to faith do the baptism. They're entrusting the discipleship to the believer, and so it's phenomenal to see. And the vision that God's given them, they're very open-handed. They're working with other churches and other denominations, and more recently, we had a mid-level there in April with about 130 people in attendance. And the senior pastor, Jimmy Scroggins, tasked vision for that we need to see thousands of churches and millions of new disciples if we're going to reach South Florida. So that's a God-sized vision that we will die for, that we will serve.
So this is quite a large church that's come on board. They haven't had to reinvent their whole model of ministry, but they've plugged the gaps in terms of mobilizing people to connect, share the gospel, make disciples, and then multiply groups and churches.
That's correct. And I think a big shift is they're casting vision for all their church members. Their phrase is, we've gathered as the church in here today. Now go be the church out there. And they're telling them, you guys are church. Go be church. Go engage lostness. This is not the role of the pastor only. This is the role of every disciple of Jesus.
So what have you learned just watching the transition there at that church?
Well, number one is just God is at work through the bride of Christ. It's easy as catalysts to just kind of move beyond the bride. And but I really believe God is at work in and through the bride of Christ to engage the lost community. It is a slower work. I would say I've learned patience with that process. I think early on in catalytic work, I was very impatient and would get frustrated with leadership when they wouldn't move forward, and have learned just to be patient. These men and leaders they've been entrusted to shepherd the sheep, and so they have that responsibility on top of a burden to engage lostness. So I think coming in a role of serving with more compassion for those leaders.
And what does your role look like then? In being a catalyst for change in a church where you're not the leader?
Yeah. Well, you've got to posture yourself. Well, I had to posture myself as a servant. And what that looked like was if they would invite me to a meeting, I would go to the meeting and sit and listen and speak when I was asked to speak. And I think that built trust with the leadership. And now I would preface that with, I saw God at work there, so I knew it was worth going to. But I didn't show up with the guy with all the answers. Just went in as a listener, and we prayed like crazy for them. We pursued the staff. I would set up, once I got permission and they gave me a seat at the table, I would pursue them, lunches and coffees, just to get to know them personally and their families, and just to develop some trust, and for them to get to know us. And then when they would ask, we would share. I would cast vision. I think a big part of our role is to cast vision, and keeping the statistics, the brutal facts of lostness in front of them, but also sharing stories of what God is doing, not just all over the world, but in the United States. And because we're practicing in their backyard, we're able to share stories of fruit from their backyard. Like, hey, this is happening here. Just last week, we saw a man come to faith and started a church in his home. We had, I think, one of the most helpful vision casts is sharing stories of what our family's doing, what our children are doing. And so they're hearing those stories from the harvest in their backyard, and they start to believe, wow, God's doing this here. And then they ask to be trained, and so we provide the training for them. But the goal of training is to help raise them up as trainers, and so that's what they're doing. They're the ones who are leading the trainings. And
you also taking them out into the field. Mm-hmm. So the training, it's both sort of, I don't want to call it the classroom, but it's both, in the classroom and it's out in the field. You're taking people out with you, giving them a taste for it.
That's correct. You go to what they invite you to. So it started off, they asked me to come to 4 staff meetings in a row in April. And I went in and cast vision and showed them the 4 fields process. And Jeff Sundell flew in for one of those and just shared stories from the harvest. But I think that initial 4 weeks in the office, I was able to get some of those guys out into the harvest in their own, their community where they were serving. And I think that was a big game changer for some of them to actually see, wow, there's people that are just waiting out here. This isn't rocket science. And as Fred Campbell says, just removing those barriers, getting them out in the harvest was a key component of that.
What have you learned just watching Jimmy in his role?
He didn't try to just sink the ship and do a quick about face. And what's unique there is Jimmy is the senior pastor, and then Steve Wright as the head of discipleship, or the executive pastor. They have a very close relationship. So I can see the enemy trying to divide them, but they're very close, and they are unified in their vision. And they say that, Jimmy has the air war where he's, in the pulpit, but also has a position within his denomination. And Steve is of the ground war. He's moving things forward on the ground. Well, in a lot of churches where we're working, you've got like an associate pastor, like a missions pastor, or a youth pastor, somebody else that's trying to drive this forward, yet the senior pastor doesn't buy in yet. Well, God gave the vision through Jimmy Scroggins, and then he invited Steve in to help him roll it out. So I think his humility of asking for help and being willing to hand over authority and responsibility to others has been huge. But at the same time, he's casting vision. Like when he speaks, people listen. And so as he's sharing stories from the harvest, as he's demonstrating this himself, as he and his family have committed to prayer walk in their community and share the gospel with all of their neighbors, that goes a long way with your people of like, I don't just expect you guys to do this, I'm doing this myself. But at the same time, he knows as he's shepherding these people, he can't be the primary person to drive this thing forward. And so I think what's happened there is he's recognized the need for apostolic leadership, and he's deferring to that.
What's being unleashed here from what you're saying is it's God's people.
That's right.
And they're becoming the foot soldiers. They're becoming the ones that are both doing this in their neighborhoods and also able to train and release others.
That's correct. One of the very first people we trained, in one of the first groups we trained, a mom, her name was Teresa, and she had never shared with anybody and had been a Christian for 20 years. And so she comes to this training for parents of the youth group. I was a youth pastor at the time. And she felt like God wanted her to share with her family. And so we're like, okay. So we came back the week 2, and she hadn't shared with them. So like, all right, make sure you do it this next week. She comes back week 3. She had not shared with them. And so we had to love Teresa and the people that God was prompting her to share with by pressing in and say, what's going on there? Like, God's clearly calling you to do this, and you're not doing this. Like why not? And she said, you don't understand. She's like, my family is like a bad talk show episode, man. She's like, I got my one. Sorry.
I got my one. Go on. That's all right. It was just scratching.
Making noise. Really?
It's all right.
I need to get a microphone. Okay.
I've got my one.
My mom just found out. We just found out my mom had committed adultery with my dad's best friend. My sister is addicted to drugs. The other one is addicted to alcohol. 2 of them are going through divorce. And I'm just supposed to share the gospel with them. And we said, hey, first of all, God's the one who told you to do that. And are you relying on you or him? She's like, I'm relying on me. So we prayed. And she came back the next week, and she's like, you're never going to believe what happened. She said, I went home, and I invited my mom to come over, and then my sisters came. I shared the gospel. They repented and believed. And so I began to disciple them. And then the husbands all wanted to hear from my husband. So my husband started looking at the Bible with them, including my dad, who just found out his wife has committed adultery. And the gospel began to bring transformation to them. Well, I'm so excited about this that I've got lunch the next day with my good friend. And instead of talking about normal things, I cast vision. I trained her. She went home and she shared with her neighbor and led her neighbor to Christ. And she started Bible study in her community. And then my husband goes to the fire department where he's volunteering, and he starts a Bible study with the firefighters and trains some of those guys. And so here's this woman that God loves her and wanted to use her as his ambassador. And yet her disobedience was keeping her from enjoying him in that way. It's like, look what God had waiting for you on the other side of obedience. Yeah. Not only for her, but for all those people that he loved and wanted to hear the message of Jesus, the good news of the gospel. So it's just one example of how believers are waiting to be mobilized and lost people are desperately waiting to hear the gospel.
One of the things that's quite distinctive about your role as a movement catalyst is the way in which you bring your whole family into that. Just talk to us a bit about, how you're on mission as a family.
Yeah. Well, we are, my wife and I, we've been married for almost 17 years. We have 6 children. Our oldest is 12. Our youngest is 10 months old. And for 12 years, I did not include my family in our ministry. When I was a youth pastor, and it was while we were in Japan that God showed me he wanted to use our whole family. And literally, I have my children begging me, Dad, we need to obey Jesus. We want to go share the gospel. They came to a training, and I had them help me with some administrative things, and their mom wasn't able to pick them up, so they stuck around. And I'm like, go color or something. And they were 8 and 10 at the time, and they were like, Dad, we we want to go share with everybody else. I'm like, no, you're going to go start a cult. You're going to get it wrong. And, but I finally was like, okay, I'll take you. And within 3 conversations at a mall, my 8-year-old son led a woman to Christ. And I realized, wow, Holy Spirit, you are working through them. Mm-hmm. So I want to preface it with that was something God has had to teach me through my children. And I see the Holy Spirit at work in them. So we've been very intentional about doing this as a family. One, because we believe that we're obeying Jesus in that. But 2, we didn't want ministry to be one more thing that pulls dad away from the family. So whether it's, event trainings, I'll kind of give them the option to come if they want to come, but a lot of times they like to come. And if they're there, we'll use them. Recently, we were out in the harvest looking for people of peace, and there was a YWAM missionary who was visiting from Texas, and he said, I want to learn how to do this. So I put him with my 10-year-old son, and they got out, they got into a home. The way they did, they knocked the door and offered prayer, and the man there he had just been in a coma for 3 weeks and said he should have died, and he didn't know why God saved him, and so he knew why they were there. So Malachi shared the gospel using 3 circles, and the man repented and believed. He immediately showed him from 2 Corinthians 5:17-21 his identity, and challenged him to share with others and equipped him. And he started a church in that man's home that day. So it's not just, this is cool to use the kids. Like, they're doing it. I mean, they're doing a lot of times better than we are because they keep it so simple.
And so there are times you just go out as a family in your own neighborhood, meeting people, knocking on doors, praying, blessing them, and then opening up a conversation that leads to the gospel. And you do that as a family.
We do that as a family. That's correct. All 6 of us. We do draw attention. But the nice thing, too, is because they've done this, when we have other groups come, we can have them train other people by taking them out in the harvest. Yeah. Like, for example, we were in this country of England recently with this crazy missionary and his lovely wife. And
was he an Australian by any chance?
He was.
Yeah.
He was a good bloke. Oz rules football all the way. Rugby, sorry. But Malachi was with a local pastor, and he was there to help equip this pastor to go door to door and see that the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Well, it was really funny in this instance. We had this downpour of rain, and so we went to the local pub, and we're in there in the pub, and we're talking to the bartender in the pub there, and Malachi goes and just shares the gospel with this bartender, right there on the bar. And the man said he was far from God, but that he'd grown up in church. So then the pastor who's with us took over the conversation. And Malachi goes back to, hey, can I get some candy? Like, he doesn't see the significance of how God is using him. But because he's done this so many times as a family, he's able to train people anywhere. God is faithful to, if we obey him and what he's calling us to, he's faithful to use us and to produce fruit and to teach us as we go. And I'm discovering that down here in South Florida. We discovered that in Japan, Indianapolis, anywhere we've served. I'm also discovering that the harvest is plentiful. God, his promises are true. I couldn't believe when we came down here how many lost people were waiting to hear the gospel. They're just waiting. 96% unchurched, number 1 population ever church. This is going to be so hard. And yet they're just waiting. And the thing that was equally surprising was how many believers are just waiting to be trained.
find out more about what the Coopers are up to, make sure you visit their website at coopersonamission.com. There'll be a link to it on the blog.